Welcome to Thrive School. I'm your host, John Meese, and I am on a mission to eradicate generational poverty by equipping entrepreneurs like you to build thriving businesses from scratch. With that in mind, let's begin today's lesson, shall we? Carole, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic.
Well, good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to have you here with me and with us talking today about your new book. But before we dive into that, I'd love to just give you a chance to share a little bit about Carole. So I'd love to know, who are you and what gets you out of bed in the morning?
Who am I? What gets me out of bed? So I am an HR professional who has spent over 26 years supporting my husband in the Air Force. As we moved around, I continually worked in roles that now all magically fall underneath the HR umbrella. And I've always had a very organic coach approach, very collaborative, very inquisitive, very curious. And so in 2013, I had the opportunity to step out on my own. And by 2016, I'd moved from HR consultant and coach to strictly executive coaching, because everybody I was coaching were leaders. And I have found that my gifts lie in grooming people to move up and promote up into more and more leadership roles. Probably because I've seen the brilliance of great leadership, not only from seeing my husband's perspective in the military, but working underneath great leaders, and the fallout from not so great leaders. And so as an advocate for your employee base, it gives me a unique perspective for leaders to consider to really elevate their professional relationships and their legacy, because they don't know what people brag about, but I can give them an idea.
Well, that's good to know, just a little bit of context in your backstory, kind of what brings you here today. But one of the things that, is new to your story is this book that you have coming out. So would you tell us a little bit about what's the book called, what's it about, and then we'll dive into actually talking about some of the takeaways from that book.
Sure. The book is called, rather long title, The Ask Framework. The subtitle is Questions That Elevate Your Influence, Performance, and Leadership. This book came about because of a really interesting performance review that I found myself surprisingly suffering through. I'd never had one. I'd always had that rock star performance review. You're doing great. Oh, can't wait. And suddenly I was victim to somebody else's ambition. And what was more interesting than that, being in that situation, because I can't fault anybody for having ambition, no matter how poorly they go about it, was that I didn't have the tools to even step in and defend myself. I was so used to waiting and gaining the compliments that I didn't even have the language. I was so frozen. And then when I started to do the research, like this couldn't have just been a one-off. Somebody else, I've heard other people experience this. Why? Why does this happen? And I found that there's a lot of beautiful research of why we don't ask more questions.
Well, I want to unpack that, but let me just make sure I understand the situation. So you had an employer at the time where you went into a performance review thinking like, gonna go get my A+ report card, go buy myself a, ice cream sundae or a margarita and celebrate afterwards. And you got sat down and you were told, we need to talk about your poor performance. Is that right?
Yes and no. My performance was actually ignored. The unique part about this is the person who was supervising me, her boss was also in this meeting. And so suddenly, instead of saying, hey, here's the typical performance review ratings or scores, there was nothing. There was no paperwork. We went to lunch. And suddenly she's like, well, I do this. She doesn't really do this. I do this. And it was so bizarre.
Oh, so she was taking credit for things that you do, or?
She was not taking credit. She was highlighting her part of the success of it was like watching a show, like somebody else's show, without realizing, wait, this was supposed to be my show. Wait. And instead of knowing how to step in and not, because I don't throw people under the bus. It's just not my style, I was just baffled. And instead of being able to say, hey, I'd like to give her credit for that, but at the same time, I'd like to highlight the value I added here and the success we've had, and knowing what other people bragged about when I was in the room, knowing the value I had added to that, I didn't have the language for it. It's not that I didn't know it.
Well, so that's interesting. I can imagine the situation, and I'm vividly remembering examples from my own professional background of similar situations now. So that's helpful. Thank you for giving a little more context on that. So this is what led you on this journey of saying, like, what do you do in situations where you don't want to throw somebody under the bus, but you really do need to speak up? And why don't we say more? So, what did you discover along the way? I mean, what were some of the most, I guess, the surprises that showed up in the research that you did leading up to this book?
The surprises that showed up were the new research on feedback, because I immediately wanted to go talk to people like, wasn't I really good here? I mean, you're suddenly needing to collect data to go, wait, am I off my rocker? And so and I was like, wait, do I ask for feedback, or is that just something I ask for? Well, we are trained on asking one question. What do you think I need to improve upon? Assuming that they'll tell you what you do good, and the whole gesture of that question allows the other person to feel useful and helpful. And they go, oh, you do so much so well, but you could do this and this. And all you're doing is collecting things to improve upon. You never get a balanced scorecard unless you ask for it. And so Harvard did some research on feedback. Why is feedback the most conflicting conversation to have, like the top 5 consistently across all organizations? It's because you don't know how to control what you feel is unjust or unfair or unbalanced information coming your way. And they really found that the power was with the receiver of the information. I mean, you and I have both been on the receiving end of somebody saying, hey, do you have a minute? Hey, have you thought about, don't you think you could do this better? Well, in reality, we know in our head we could take it or, spike that football in the trash can, because we may not really agree with it or have context. So if the control of that information is within the receiver's power, then we're teaching people how to give feedback. We're spending time in the wrong place. We should spend time into really helping receivers of information ask for what they want, when they need it, when they can use it, which means going and asking for the positive information you want. And so there was a whole series of research that went along with that.
Well, this is really vital, because I'm just thinking about, I mean, one of the things that really caught my eye when you reached out about us having this conversation was just the fact that imposter syndrome is so prevalent in entrepreneurs, right? And that's, and that's who's listening to Thrive School, are small business owners and entrepreneurs who are thinking, okay, maybe I don't have an employer I'm worried about, but maybe it's just that I don't have one employer, I have 100, right? Whether that's my customers or my clients. And it can be hard to get customer feedback because people are, if you're so, they're polite. If now you hear about it if you're amazing or if you are just like awful. Like you hear about it, those two. But if you're in this realm of you're like, I'm not getting a lot of feedback that I'm amazing, I'm not getting a lot of feedback that I'm horrible, but there's something about my business that can improve and I'm sure of it. I'd love to think about it from that lens, because whether I'm, I myself, like I work directly with clients where it's I'm self-employed, but like it's sort of like an employer relationship, right? They're paying me money to do a thing and I'm asking them for feedback along the way. And the same thing goes with the customers who are in my co-working space or in one of my training programs. So with that in mind, I'd love to kind of just dive into this a little bit deeper. So knowing that if I'm the one on the receiving end, right? If we're on the receiving end of ultimately of feedback, then, and we are the ones with power, how do we harness that? I mean, are there certain questions we should ask or certain habits we should cultivate to get that kind of feedback that we need?
Yes. In fact, this is where I get to, as a friend of mine who wrote a book on imposter syndrome, Chris Kelso, says, I get to help you be the explorer and go after the information you want, especially the positive information. So based on research and appreciative inquiry, finding out what you do right first expands your capacity to be more creative when it comes to areas of problem solving. So even if you're stepping into a conversation with a client who's potentially unhappy, or you have a vibe that maybe I'm walking into, ooh, I have no idea. If you step into the conversation with context, clarity, I would really like to ask you about my performance in serving you, right? That just give them a context that frames it. It sets the other person up for success. But only ask them one thing. What's the one thing I do really well with you as my client? And they will find it. Well, you answer the phone when I call. It could be just that small. But what you want to do is then say, can you give me an example of how you experienced that? Because now you're asking them to let you see yourself through their eyes. And when you do that, you are gifting them the respect and the authenticity of a relationship they want. Even if they called you and they were unhappy, if you start on that and they have the opportunity to say something and share with you their vision, even if they turn it to something they're unhappy about, you can say, oh, okay, I take it that you're frustrated. Call it what it is. It's a neutral term. You are frustrated. Give me some context. What is this about? Because then they'll return the favor. They will say, it's about that car part that I ordered, whatever it is. And say, what is the most important thing I can do to make this up to you at this moment? And can you paint me a picture of what success looks like through your eyes? So you literally just with this framework, this context, one thing, example, framework, you're in the driver's seat of helping that person step into the conversation that is useful for both of you. And if they want to bring up a second thing, this is a brilliant moment. Like, you know what? I really can only handle one thing at a time to make you happy. Can I call you back for the second one? And you give your brain the respect it needs and space to unpack the one thing. And there is some research in science, neuroscience says we can think about three things, but we can only focus on one at any given time. And the moment they give you more than one thing, you weigh them equally. So by asking for what's the most important thing first, you've found their trigger point. The rest is just icing on the cake. So it's a way to step into a conversation with anybody. The people who never give you feedback because they're like, meh, what do they need to hear from me for? Those are the best clients to contact. If you've never heard from them, reach out.
So
be
reach
in the
out.
Driver's seat of that.
Right. So reach out. So I can reach out to a client right now. And actually, so I'm actually wrapping up right now a big contract with a client. This is the last month of it. They asked me to renew, but it's book launch season for me. So I held my breath and said no, which is like the best place to be in as an entrepreneur. But it's actually because they're a wonderful client. I just need to focus on my book launch. But still, so you're saying like I could reach back out to them now and say, because I think they were pleased. I mean, like it seems like we did good things together. So, but you're saying I could reach out to them right now and say, hey, I'd love to know what's the one thing that I do, that I really have done really well in our time working together, and then pause. And can you give me an example of how you experienced that? Would that be a good use of this framework?
Yes, it's exactly. And there's an added bonus at the end, because if it's a great example and you really want to know more, then that very next thing is like, how can we continue this relationship after my book launch? What would be something you would like for me to reach out to you? What does the next step look like for you? You can always continue the conversation into actionable items. What and how questions are really useful here. They play a part in you building that highway forward, regardless of what the topic of the conversation is, because it shows you're interested and you value them.
Hey there, it's me, John, just talking to you. I know that you are a busy entrepreneur with an endless to-do list. You don't need another tactic or another gimmick to try. You need focus and you need results. You are not content to just survive with your business. You want to thrive. And I want the same thing for you. That is why I have created a complimentary business assessment that gives you a numerical score for how well your business is currently doing based on the fundamental ingredients to long-term business success. Once you know your score, you can hyper-focus your tactical efforts on improving your marketing, sales, or financial systems so you can watch your score and your bank account grow. Visit yourthrivescore.com to claim your free assessment today. let's go back to the example you shared of that fateful lunch. I don't know why. So we have a restaurant, and we have a restaurant in Franklin, Tennessee called Bricktops. But I just realized that in my head, when you described that situation, you were at lunch at Bricktops. I don't know if that was where you were actually when that happened, but like you were actually in my head out in the outdoor patio at Bricktops, sitting down, enjoying lunch when you were suddenly surprised by how this conversation was going. But let's go back to that example for a minute. So you sat down for a performance review. Your supervisor is saying, you know, Carole's done some really cool things. For example, I really helped her with all of these things. You know, and then the other supervisor is going, well, that's great. I mean, y'all are just great. And you're realizing, wait a second, this is not what I expected. So how would you, in hindsight, have used what you know now about questions in that situation to respond differently?
Well, trust me, I've rerun that luncheon
I'm not
million
trying
times.
to
No, that's good.
Summon your nightmares, but
no, it was a really good learning moment for me. It was a catalyst for me. So I think given the opportunity to relive that, you know how wisdom is sometimes late in life when you really wish you'd had it way back when, I would have said, you know, hey, given the project, I would list the context would have been a specific project. What was the, you know, I remember doing this. What was the most valuable asset to the company that came out of that? That'd be the one thing I asked. And can you give me an example of how you recognize that every day? And I'm just driving home the fact that something I did has a now return on investment. What would you like to see me do next about that project? How would you like us to elevate the return on investment of that project? I really would have been more prepared really to step in and not brag. Just say, hey, given this, I remember doing this. Can you tell me the one thing it really added to the value of everybody's ease of access, whatever it was, and continue that way. So it's a way of saying something that triggers a good conversation and then allowing them to step in and do the bragging for you.
You know, I love that. I think it sets you up as you said, it gives you control, but without you coming across as dominant, right? Because you're asking a question. I mean, it's an innocent question, but it sets them up to really compliment you in a way that, whether it's publicly or privately, really emphasizes your value. And so I love that. I'm thinking of a couple of practical examples of how this could work right now in terms of, you know, one of the hardest things, I don't know, that's not true. It's not one of the hardest things, but one of the things that we all have to figure out in business is how to get feedback from partners, customers, clients, you name it. There are the awkward situations where you're with a client and they're telling you something that they're not pleased about, right? There are those. And I've used variations of, you know, unpacking a conversation about, you know, really asking them to, let's work together on you know, casting a vision of what a win or what success looks like. But honestly, usually when I bring that up, it's because I think that I'm not sure what there is a win. Like, I think like I was just kind of like, no matter what happened, it was going to be wrong, you know? And so usually when I ask that question, that's where I'm coming from. So this is a much more balanced approach to that. I like that. But one of the things that I'm thinking right now that's really practical about this is really just getting reviews. Because I think like, you know, whether it's whatever the product is, right? Whether it's a high touch product, like a client contract where you're going to actually be talking to the client and asking them for an endorsement or review, whether it's getting a review for a book or for a product you sell off the shelf, that's something that you need to do, right? Is on a regular basis, ask people for a review. But it's weird to say like, hey, would you just give us a review on Google? By the way, we really like 5 stars. Like, it's just like, it's so awkward and sleazy. And yes, I also only want 5 stars. So so I got one 4-star review on my book on Amazon, by the way. No comments attached to it, just a 4-star review, but the rest are all 5.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, there are those people out there who will never give 100%. They'll never give a 5, as if they're questioning what's perfect. And it's
I know they're saving the 5. They're saving it for like the Mona Lisa or something. That's fine. Who knows? That's fine. But my point is that I really like this because right now I'm thinking that you basically just wrote the copy for a really simple automated email that anyone you're listening to this, I want you to do this right now. Set up an automated email so that someone buys your product, and depending on the product, right? So if it's a consumable like coffee, okay, maybe you're following up later that day or like an hour later. If it's something that you're shipping to them, maybe it's something you're following up with, of course, definitely after the product has arrived. So you got to think about that. But whatever the timing is, have just an automated email or text that goes out to your customers just to say, you know, hey, we just wanted to check in. You know, we love hearing from our customers. what's the one thing that we did really well? What in your experience working with that so far? And could you give us an example of how you experienced that? And that could actually literally just be like, you could literally just frame this as like, hey, what's the one thing that we did really well? We would love it if you would share that, an example of that in a public review. And here's a link. Because then all of a sudden, if people are already thinking about the really good thing, they're going to naturally give you 5 stars, unless they're one of those stingy 4-star people or 3-star people. And that's okay. There's room for them.
I think you can be as specific as you want to. Contextually, we are looking for customers who want to give us a 5-star rating. What is the one thing we did for you that warrants a 5-star rating? And can you give us an example of your experience with that? And if so, we'd love to, can we put that on the public forum? It's setting people up for success allows them to know exactly where you're at with this. Because sometimes when we get automated anything, I'll back up here. There's a quote that someone sent me recently or said to me. It's one of those ones that's stuck in your brain. You forget where the roots were. But the confused mind will always say no. And I go, wow. I said, and so the lack of confusion, we're looking for 5-star experiences. What was the one thing we did that gave you a 5-star experience? And can you share what that looked like from your perspective?
Well, I love that. And just to unpack this a little bit more of just how this applies to business, I think that the reality is, I think a lot of us know, or a lot of people know that concept. I know that concept that like the confused mind loses or says no, or doesn't make a decision, honestly, because no is just sometimes just a non-answer is no.
Yeah, non-answer.
Right? Yeah. But I think what's really powerful about this is that it's a very simple solution there, because I know that confusion is overwhelming to people. And so when I ask like mentors of mine, really busy best-selling authors and people like that to endorse my book, I ask them to do it, and I try to make it as easy as possible, but I didn't make it this easy. Right? Like I overcomplicated it even when I was trying to make it easy. When I was like, would you be willing to do it? Just say yes. And I will write you 3 versions where you can pick your favorite and then you can tweak it, right? I'll write 3 versions of an endorsement where you can take one that sounds like you can tweak it however you want, but I've already written it for you, right? I've already done the hard work. So you just have to make it sound like you and make sure that you believe it, and then send it back, right? So I'm trying to make it easy. But honestly, if I just said like, hey, by the way, here's my book. I know you asked for a copy of it. I would love to know. Like right now, I'm trying to think about this because we released the ebook early for my book. Like the actual paperback doesn't come out until July, but the ebook released in March, and it was the #1 bestseller. So I've got so many people that read the ebook, and I'm trying to figure out how many times I can come back and just say, "Would you leave a review?" Like without it just being like just too many. I'm trying to figure. So this is actually great. I love that. So by the way, those of you listening to this podcast, if you've read my book, I'm looking, you got to grade me on this, Carole. You got to grade me on this. I'm looking for 5-star reviews. And so I'd love to know, what is the one thing that you found really useful from my book, Survive and Thrive, How to Build a Profitable Business in Any Economy, including this one. So if you could give me an example of that, go to surviveandthrivebook.com/review and share that. And I would love to hear from you. How'd I do, Carole?
Great.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Well, I love that. So, that's a great example. And that alone, if we covered nothing else, that would be a very practical tip. And I love that. But I'm sure there's more in the book, right? Otherwise it'd be a very short book if it's just that one question. So
there's a lot of examples of where they could be applied, but you provided one that we didn't dig into, where you said that you're sitting down with the client. What if the client's not happy? And when I started off, I said, context, one thing, example, and what and how questions. When someone is unhappy, do it in reverse. What would you like to see happen now? How would you like to move forward next? Can you give me an example of what success is going to look like for this to resolve? What's the first thing, or the one thing, what's the first thing I should do next? Are we talking about the same thing? So that's why I called it a framework, because you can mix it around and play as long as you get the parts of the puzzle. It still paints the same picture, but you come across as professional and inclusive. And people are really wanting that type of relationship that you were professional, you handled everything beautifully, you included my perspective, and my insights. And I felt I was at the table with you.
I love that. Well, obviously, this is a really robust framework. And so I'm excited to, I know the book's just now coming out, so I haven't actually got my hands on it yet, but I'm excited to dive into it. So for those who are listening to this that would love to get a copy or just learn more about you, Carole, whether it's learn more about what you're up to yourself or about your book, where's the best place we can go to learn more about you and your book online?
So I do have a website, yay, relevant-insight.com. And it's, if you go to that website, right on the homepage, you'll see a section like get the free introductory chapter of this book and sign up for an email so you'll know exactly when we do the ebook and when the print is available. Because like you, it's book launch season. And like many with COVID who decided to take that project they've been loving on for a long time and put it with a publisher, we're all in line to be printed. We're all in line.
Yeah.
So I would appreciate all insights. On the upcoming book, and I would love to include lots of people who would like to know more.
That's great, Carole. Well, thank you. I appreciate you sharing that with us. So that's relevant-insight.com. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
All right. Wonderful. Well, Carole, thanks again for joining us today. And I appreciate what you're up to. And please keep up the good work.
Well, you too. Book publishing and book launching and connecting with our clients is the most important thing we can do to get our great stuff out in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yep. To get more people just making the world a better place. Ultimately, get the information out of the brains and into the world where other people can put it into practice. Definitely reconnecting all of those parts. So I appreciate time with you today because it's been a joy. Thank you, Carole. Appreciate that. Thank you for listening to Thrive School. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and leave a review. You can find the full transcript of this episode along with related resources at johnmeese.com. As always, keep up the good work.